A little bit about the book itself, and then I'm going to introduce the panelists as such. I guess we're just going to have a fun chat, basically. We just decided to do something a bit special here. And this is really like the launch for the book. I did live in New York City for the best part of 20 years. I've been living up this area for the last 4+ years, and thrilled to be here. It is a common and constant kind of migration, and we'll talk about, you know, why that happens, but I'm thrilled to live up here. And even though we're doing a lot of events in the city, everybody sort of felt that this should be the main event. So that's why we have the sparkling wine and the food and so on. You know, we'll talk more about the book. I'm happy to, you know, take some questions. We are going to be finishing about 6:30. You know, basically, I'm going to give this in a nutshell. I have written about bands before and biographies on groups, and I felt that New York City, you know, I landed in New York City for a journalist assignment in 1986, and it was one of those eureka moments that I just felt the moment I hit the ground that I wanted to live in this place. And that was from somebody who'd grown up in London, and always thought London was the greatest place on earth, and had a kind of inherent sort of prejudice, not necessarily against New York City, certainly. It was instilled in us in our generation against America. And I landed in New York, and I was like, I just want to live here, and it took me 18 months to figure it out. And interestingly enough, at the start of the book, somebody who was much younger than me when he first came, but the book opens in 1927 with a character called Mario Bauza, who was really instrumental in modern music. There would be no Afro-Cuban jazz without him. The mambo would not have sounded the same, bebop would not have sounded the same. He came to New York at the age of 16 in the spring of 1927, at the peak of the jazz age, the peak of the Harlem Renaissance. He was with an orchestra from Havana. He was a prodigy, clarinet prodigy, but he was dark-skinned. And in Havana, in Cuba, there was literally a caste system, and if you were dark-skinned as opposed to light-skinned, you were not going to be able to ever lead an orchestra. And he came to Harlem and realized that, you know, you actually you could have dark skin and be an enormous success in New York. And the book opens with his kind of like trying to see New York City through his eyes in that spring of 1927, before, you know, it's 18 months or whatever, or 2 years before the Great Wall Street crash. So at that point, I think people thought the world was as big and as great and as fast as it ever could be. And for a while, they were probably right. It took a while to pick back up again. So that seemed like a really good place to start the book. You know, jazz is up and running, and we don't need to try and explain what jazz music is, but we can talk about the Latin influence. And chapter by chapter, it goes through different neighborhoods and different genres. So, you know, we've got Afro-Cuban music, we've got bebop, we've got the original Harlem vocal groups after World War II. We've got the folk scene that comes out of Greenwich Village in terms of the almanac singers and that kind of Woody and Leadbelly and Josh White era. We've got the mambo. We've got the real heyday of the vocal groups, you know, Frankie Lyman and the Teenagers, that kind of period. We go back to the folk scene. We've got the songwriters that we tend to call them the Brill Building songwriters, though actually the hit building was called the Music Building over the road. A lot of those people came from South Brooklyn. A lot of them were middle-class Jewish people. It was like a real demographic that ended up changing the American songbook. There's another chapter on the girl groups that kind of followed on from that. Chapter about the original songwriters, Bob Dylan and co, and what they did. One about the village plugging in, so we've got the Loving Spoonful, the Rascals, the Blues Project. Another one, of course, about the Lower East Side and the East Village, Velvet Underground, the Thugs, and I believe Ed Sanders is busy at home working on his memoirs right now, and he did, you know, pass on his best wishes. Because he's another person who lives up here. So, you know, the Fugs and the Gods and David Pure on the Lower East Side. We have a chapter on the birth of disco, which really is a New York City music scene. We will be talking about it actually. That really came out of New York. Chapter on the glitter scene, we'll be talking about that later. Chapter on the Lower East Side punk scene with CBGBs, we will certainly be talking about that. And the book ends with the very early days of hip-hop, which did get going in like 73, 74. There were no records came out until 79, 80. And that's past the period that I decided to end the book. I just thought take these 50 years in the middle of the decade, and it kind of just really helps frame the story. I think to have gone much further would have involved kind of losing the perspective. I think if you're going to write a book of this kind of stretch, you need to have a perspective on your finishing date, so that you're not trying to kind of second guess what might end up happening. So I kind of do at the very end sort of race forward, and I think in a way that the natural ending would be something like Blondie doing Rapture, where all these, the disco and the punk and the hip hop actually meets, and in a way that would be the full stop. But I kind of close it out in '77 and then just do a little fast forward to that. A lot of work doing the book, but I'm actually I feel now like it was, I should never, no man should ever try and to make this comparison, but it does feel a little like giving birth. It feels incredibly painful, and then it's here, and it's absolutely wonderful and beautiful, and I'm really glad my kids are here tonight as well, Campbell and Noel. So what I wanted to do was, I'm going to introduce the panelists, or I guess as we'll call it, and I'm going to read, to introduce them, I'm going to read sections from the book, and that way that gets done with the reading part of it as well. But what I'm going to do for the most part is actually read a couple of things that ended up in the sort of cutting room floor. I could have written that much, and I had a very, very good editor who brought it down to this. And what you'll find from this is that if you think you know these people that are going to be sitting up here tonight, you're going to find out just how early they were involved in the scene. And most of what I write about in the book is really about the very, very, very early days. It's the underground. And I kind of like to end my chapters when things take off and go into the mainstream. I kind of feel that's a good point to get out of the story. So I'm going to start with Eric Weisberg, and I haven't really figured this out. I don't know if all four people want to come and sit up here now, or maybe I can just read about you and then bring you up. What do you guys want to do? Or you want to come up one by one? You want me to just introduce? Yeah. Why don't you come up? So we've got Eric Weisberg and Tommy Ramone and Fred Smith and Ollie Green here.